Blood and power, two sides of the same tarnished coin, have a way of consuming the men who covet them most. Imagine the scene: Berlin, April 1945. A city not of life but of ghosts and echoes. A symphony of destruction played by Soviet artillery. Deep beneath the rubble, in a concrete tomb reeking of damp concrete, desperation and decay, a man, once the master of a continent, now a prisoner of his own making, trembles. His hands shake not with the palsy of old age, but with the tremors of a profound, all-consuming failure. This is Adolf Hitler in his final act, a pathetic creature stripped of his mythos. But was his end a final, defiant act of a warlord, or the pathetic, whimpering exit of a coward? And now, please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. The story of this man, this architect of genocide, does not begin in the thunder of battle or the roar of adoring crowds, but in the quiet, seething bitterness of a defeated nation. To understand the monster, one must first understand the swamp in which it was spawned. The Germany of the 1920s was a nation on its knees, a proud people humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, its economy crippled by hyperinflation where a wheelbarrow of banknotes could barely buy a loaf of bread, and its soul haunted by the ghosts of the millions lost in the Great War. It was a landscape of profound disillusionment, a vacuum of hope where extremist ideologies could fester and grow like a gangrenous wound. Into this void stepped a failed artist, a former corporal with a burning resentment and a mesmerizing, almost hypnotic ability to channel the collective rage of a broken people. His words were not promises of peace or reconciliation, but of vengeance, of a restored national pride built upon the bedrock of racial hatred and the identification of scapegoats. The Jewish people, the communists, the liberals, the so-called November criminals who had signed the armistice, all became targets for this venomous rhetoric. The nascent Nazi Party, with its thuggish brown shirts and its potent theatrical rallies, offered a seductive illusion of strength and order in a world of chaos. They did not just promise a better future, they promised a glorious Thousand-Year Reich, a destiny forged in blood and fire. This was not merely politics, it was a dark religion, and Hitler was its high priest, his speeches the liturgy of a nation's damnation. He preyed upon the deepest fears and darkest impulses of the German people, transforming their economic despair into a crusade of racial purity and military conquest, a transformation that would set the world ablaze and lead to the most horrific chapter in human history. The Weimar Republic, with its fragile democracy and its endless political infighting, was no match for the relentless, brutal efficiency of the Nazi machine. It was a house built on sand, and when the storm came, it collapsed with terrifying speed, paving the way for the rise of a dictator who would redefine the very meaning of evil. The world watched, a mixture of apprehension and underestimation, as this demagogue clawed his way to the chancellorship in 1933, an event that was not an aberration of history, but the terrifyingly logical conclusion of a nation's descent into madness. The ascent was dizzyingly swift, a masterclass in political brutality and manipulation. Once the reins of power were in his grasp, Hitler did not hesitate. The Reichstag fire, a suspicious blaze that consumed the German parliament building, became the perfect pretext to suspend civil liberties and unleash a wave of terror against his political opponents. The Enabling Act followed, effectively dissolving the Weimar Constitution and granting Hitler dictatorial powers. The Night of the Long Knives saw the brutal purging of his own party, the elimination of any potential rivals within the SA, a clear and bloody message that absolute loyalty was the only currency of this new regime. The state was remade in his image. The Gestapo, the secret state police, became a symbol of pervasive, omniscient terror, their black leather coats the harbinger of a midnight knock from which few returned. The Nuremberg laws codified the persecution of the Jews, stripping them of their citizenship, their property, their humanity, a systematic dehumanization that was the necessary prelude to the industrialized slaughter that would follow. The economy, once in ruins, was mobilized for war. The construction of the Autobahn and the rearmament of the Wehrmacht, creating a facade of prosperity while the nation was being forged into a weapon. Propaganda, orchestrated by the diabolical genius of Joseph Goebbels, saturated every facet of German life. The radio, the cinema, the newspapers, all broadcast a single, monolithic message of Aryan supremacy and the infallibility of the Führer. Children were indoctrinated from birth in the Hitler Youth, their minds molded into instruments of the state, their loyalty to Hitler superseding their loyalty to their own families. It was a total state, a totalitarian nightmare that left no room for dissent, no space for individual thought. And as Germany grew stronger, the world looked on with a fatal mixture of appeasement and fear. The reoccupation of the Rhineland, the Anschluss with Austria, the annexation of the Sudetenland, each violation of the Treaty of Versailles was met with little more than diplomatic hand-wringing. The Munich Agreement of 1938, where Britain and France effectively handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler in a desperate bid for peace in our time, was perhaps the greatest act of self-delusion in modern history. It was seen as a triumph of diplomacy, but it was, in reality, a green light for aggression, a signal to the dictator that his ambitions would go unchecked. He had promised his people a Reich that would last 1,000 years, and as he stood on the precipice of war, it seemed to many, both inside and outside Germany, that he might just succeed. The world was about to learn the true cost of underestimating the ambitions of a man who saw conquest not just as a political goal, but as a historical and racial imperative. The initial years of the war were a testament to the terrifying efficiency of the German war machine. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, tore through Poland in a matter of weeks, a brutal demonstration of the combined power of tanks, planes, and infantry. Denmark and Norway fell soon after. Then came the masterstroke, the audacious invasion of France through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, a move that outflanked the Maginot Line and brought a great European power to its knees in just 6 weeks. Paris, the city of light, fell into darkness. Hitler stood at the Eiffel Tower, the conqueror of a continent, the master of Europe. The Battle of Britain was his first significant setback, the defiant resistance of the Royal Air Force preventing a German invasion and demonstrating that the island nation would not be so easily subdued. But this was a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of his ambitions. His gaze turned eastward, towards the vast plains of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June of 1941, was the largest invasion in human history, an ideological war of annihilation aimed at destroying Judeo-Bolshevism and securing Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. The initial successes were staggering. The Wehrmacht pushed deep into Soviet territory, capturing millions of prisoners and reaching the gates of Moscow. It seemed as though the Soviet Union, like France, would collapse under the weight of the German onslaught. But the Russian winter, the same brutal force that had defeated Napoleon, came to the rescue. The German advance stalled, the soldiers ill-equipped for the freezing temperatures, their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The Battle of Stalingrad became the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, a meat grinder of a battle that bled the German Sixth Army dry and ended in a catastrophic surrender. It was a defeat from which the Wehrmacht would never fully recover, a blow not just to their military strength, but to the myth of their invincibility. In the deserts of North Africa, Rommel, the Desert Fox, was defeated at El Alamein. And then, on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the industrial might of the United States into the war. The tide had turned. The Thousand-Year Reich, which had once seemed an imminent reality, was now facing a war on 2 fronts against a coalition of powers that dwarfed it in terms of manpower and industrial capacity. The dream was beginning to curdle into a nightmare. The decline was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing decay, a mirror of the physical and mental disintegration of the Führer himself. As the war turned against him, Hitler retreated further and further into the fantasy world of the Wolf's Lair and later the Führerbunker, surrounding himself with sycophants who would feed his delusions and shield him from the harsh reality of Germany's impending defeat. His health, always a subject of morbid fascination, began to deteriorate rapidly. His left hand developed a pronounced tremor, which he would often hide behind his back or by clasping his hands together. His posture became stooped, his walk a shuffling gait. His skin grew pasty and his eyes, once so mesmerizing to the masses, became dull and clouded. He was a cocktail of ailments, real and imagined, treated by his personal physician, Theodor Morell, with a bizarre and dangerous concoction of drugs, including amphetamines, barbiturates, and even preparations containing bull semen. This daily regimen of injections turned him into a paranoid, irritable wreck, prone to violent outbursts of rage and long periods of sullen depression. His military decisions became increasingly erratic and divorced from reality. He would move non-existent armies on his maps, order counteroffensives by divisions that had been wiped out weeks before, and refuse to countenance any form of strategic retreat, declaring that any ground gained must be held to the last man. The July 20th plot of 1944, when a group of courageous officers led by Claus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate him with a bomb at the Wolf's Lair, was a stark demonstration of the growing dissent within the highest ranks of the Wehrmacht. Hitler survived the blast, protected by a heavy oak table, but the event shattered his already fragile nerves and deepened his paranoia. The purge that followed was savage. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed, their deaths often filmed for the Führer's private viewing. He had become a prisoner of his own creation, a spider trapped in the center of a web of terror and deceit, his grip on reality slipping with each passing day. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, opened up the long-awaited Second Front, and the relentless advance of the Red Army from the east squeezed the Reich into an ever-shrinking pocket of resistance. The war was lost, a fact obvious to everyone except the man who had started it. He clung to the desperate hope of a miracle weapon or a fracture in the Allied coalition, a testament to his profound inability to accept failure. The end was coming, not with a bang, but with the slow, inexorable crawl of defeat. The final days in the Führerbunker were a descent into a subterranean madness, a grotesque theater of the absurd played out as the world above burned. The bunker itself was a concrete labyrinth, a tomb-like structure some 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, protected by reinforced concrete walls thick enough to withstand the heaviest Allied bombs. But it could not protect its inhabitants from the psychological claustrophobia of impending doom. The air was thick with the stench of stale cigarette smoke, sweat, and fear, the constant drone of the ventilation system a maddening soundtrack to the end of the world. The ground trembled incessantly from the impact of Soviet shells, each explosion a reminder of the enemy's proximity. Hitler, a stooped and shuffling figure, presided over this macabre court. His daily routine was a pathetic parody of his former power. He would hold military conferences where he would rage at his generals, accusing them of treason and incompetence, his voice a hoarse shriek, his body trembling with impotent fury. He would pore over maps, his shaking hands struggling to move the colored pins representing armies that were either encircled or had ceased to exist. He found solace in the company of his German shepherd, Blondie, and his inner circle of fanatical loyalists, including the ever-present Goebbels, the sinister Martin Bormann, and his long-term mistress, Eva Braun. Braun, a woman who had been a largely invisible figure throughout the Reich, arrived in the bunker in mid-April, a final, futile gesture of loyalty to the man she loved. Her presence brought a strange, almost surreal domesticity to the bunker's grim atmosphere. They would take tea, listen to records, and reminisce about the past, a bizarre island of normalcy in a sea of chaos. But there was no escaping the reality of the situation. The news from the outside world was a relentless drumbeat of defeat. Vienna had fallen. The Americans and Soviets had linked up at the Elbe. The final, desperate defense of Berlin, entrusted to a ragtag army of old men and child soldiers from the Hitler Youth, was collapsing. The end was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, measured in hours, not days. The final act of this tragedy was about to begin. The atmosphere in the bunker grew heavier, more suffocating, with each passing hour. The news that Heinrich Himmler, the loyal Heinrich, the architect of the final solution, was attempting to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies behind his back, sent Hitler into one of his most volcanic rages. It was the ultimate betrayal, a confirmation of his deepest-seated paranoia that he was surrounded by traitors. This, more than any military defeat, seemed to break his spirit. He resolved to die, to rob his enemies of the satisfaction of capturing him alive. He would not be paraded through the streets of Moscow in a cage, a fate he morbidly obsessed over after the public execution of Mussolini. On April 29th, in the early hours of the morning, he dictated his final political testament and his private will. The testament was a final, rambling tirade, a venomous screed that blamed international Jewry for the war and exhorted the German people to continue the struggle. It was the work of a man utterly detached from reality, his mind a closed loop of hatred and self-pity. Then came the most surreal event of all. In a small, makeshift ceremony, he married Eva Braun. She had been his mistress for over a decade, a shadowy figure kept hidden from the German public. Now, as the world came crashing down around them, she would be his wife for a little over a day. The wedding breakfast that followed was a somber, funereal affair, attended by the Goebbels, Bormann, and a few secretaries. The talk was not of the future, but of the most efficient methods of suicide. Hitler had already tested his cyanide capsules on his beloved dog, Blondie, a final, cruel act to ensure their efficacy. He gave capsules to his secretaries, a final, chilling gift from their Führer. The bunker had become a death cult, its inhabitants preparing for a collective Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods. The final farewells were made. Hitler walked down the line of his remaining staff, shaking their hands, his eyes glazed over, a man already dead to the world. He retired to his private study with his new wife. The time had come. The final moments were shrouded in a silence that was more terrifying than the thunder of the artillery outside. At around 3:30 in the afternoon on April 30th, 1945, after a quiet lunch of spaghetti, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their private suite. The remaining inhabitants of the bunker waited in the corridor, a small, terrified audience for an event they could not see. The minutes ticked by. Then, a single gunshot, muffled by the heavy door, but unmistakable in the tense silence. After a few moments of hesitation, Hitler's valet, Heinz Ling, and Martin Bormann slowly opened the door. The scene inside was one of grotesque, pathetic finality. The small room smelled of bitter almonds from the cyanide and the acrid cordite from the gunshot. Eva Braun was slumped on the sofa to Hitler's left. She had bitten into a cyanide capsule. Her face was contorted in a final, agonizing grimace. Hitler sat next to her, slumped forward. A Walther PPK 7.6 5mm pistol lay on the floor by his feet. He had shot himself through the right temple. A small pool of blood was soaking into the floral pattern of the sofa, a stark crimson stain on the cheap fabric. A trickle of blood ran down his chin and onto his uniform, which was, as always, immaculately clean. His eyes were open, staring blankly at nothing. The master of the Third Reich, the man who had plunged a continent into war and murdered millions, was dead. There was no Wagnerian opera, no glorious last stand, just a squalid, lonely end in a concrete basement. It was not the death of a god, but the death of a man, a pathetic, cowardly exit for a tyrant who had demanded the ultimate sacrifice from millions but could not face the consequences of his own actions. The myth had been extinguished by a single, self-inflicted bullet. The aftermath was a frantic, desperate attempt to erase the evidence, to prevent the body of the Führer from becoming a trophy for his enemies. Following Hitler's explicit instructions, the bodies were carried up the emergency exit of the bunker and into the Chancellery garden. The scene outside was apocalyptic. The sky was black with smoke, the air filled with the dust of pulverized buildings, and the ground was a churned-up morass of mud and shell craters. The constant roar of Soviet artillery provided a hellish soundtrack to the proceedings. The bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun were placed in a shallow bomb crater. Several cans of petrol, which had been painstakingly siphoned from damaged vehicles, were poured over them. Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, Heinz Ling, and Hitler's SS adjutant, Otto Gunsche, stood by as a lit rag was tossed onto the gasoline-soaked corpses. The bodies ignited with a whoosh, a plume of greasy, black smoke rising into the Berlin sky. But the cremation was a rushed, amateurish affair. The fire was not hot enough to consume the bodies completely. The Soviet shelling forced the small group of mourners to repeatedly take cover, and they could not tend to the pyre properly. The result was a horrific, half-charred mess. Later that evening, what remained of the bodies was buried in another shallow crater. The next day, Joseph and Magda Goebbels followed their Führer in death. After poisoning their 6 children with cyanide, they too committed suicide. Their bodies also partially burned in the Chancellery Garden. The remaining inhabitants of the bunker attempted to break out of the Soviet encirclement, but most were either killed or captured. The Soviets, who stormed the Reich Chancellery on May 2nd, were desperate to find Hitler, dead or alive. They discovered the partially buried and charred remains, but Stalin, ever the paranoid conspirator, refused to believe it. For decades, the Soviet Union perpetuated the myth that Hitler had escaped, perhaps to South America or Antarctica, a useful piece of propaganda to sow discord among the Western Allies. The truth was far more sordid. The Soviets secretly held the remains, conducting multiple autopsies to confirm the identity through dental records. The final, ignominious chapter came in 1970, when the KGB, on orders from Moscow, exhumed the last remains from a secret burial site in Magdeburg, crushed them into dust, and scattered them into a tributary of the Elbe River. There would be no grave, no shrine, no final resting place for the man who had brought so much death and destruction to the world. The death of Adolf Hitler was more than just the end of a single, monstrous life. It was the symbolic death of an ideology that had held a nation and a continent in its thrall. His suicide was not an act of heroic defiance, but the ultimate act of narcissistic cowardice. He had orchestrated a global catastrophe, demanded the sacrifice of an entire generation of German youth, and presided over the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. Yet he could not face the judgment of the world or the people he had so catastrophically misled. He chose to exit the stage in a squalid, self-inflicted act of violence, leaving his nation in ruins and his followers to face the consequences of his crimes. The legacy of his 12-year Reich is a scar on the face of human history, a permanent reminder of the depths of depravity to which humanity can sink when fueled by hatred, intolerance, and the seductive poison of totalitarianism. The name Hitler has become synonymous with evil, a byword for a form of tyranny so absolute and so murderous that it almost defies comprehension. The discovery of the concentration camps by Allied soldiers laid bare the full, unimaginable horror of his regime. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the mountains of shoes and hair, the emaciated survivors, all testament to a crime so vast it required the invention of a new word, genocide. His death did not cleanse the world of his poison. The ideologies he championed, the hatreds he stoked, the resentments he exploited, did not vanish with the smoke from his funeral pyre. They linger still in the dark corners of the internet, in the rhetoric of demagogues, in the acts of violence committed in the name of racial or ethnic supremacy. The story of his horrible death is therefore not just a piece of morbid history, it is a timeless and urgent warning. It is a warning about the fragility of democracy, the dangers of unchecked power, and the terrifying speed at which a civilized society can descend into barbarism. It reminds us that evil is not always a monstrous caricature. It can be banal, bureaucratic, and chillingly efficient. And it poses a question that every generation must answer for itself. How do we recognize the seeds of such hatred, and how do we stop them from taking root before they blossom into another Holocaust? The final, pathetic image of the trembling tyrant in his bunker is a stark reminder that the most grandiose ambitions, when built on a foundation of lies and cruelty, will ultimately collapse into a pile of rubble and ash. The final analysis of this man's end reveals a profound and disturbing symmetry. His entire political existence was predicated on the idea of a glorious death in battle, a heroic sacrifice for the nation. The Nazi ideology was saturated with a death cult mentality, from the glorification of fallen party martyrs to the demand for total suicidal resistance in the final days of the war. Yet, when his own moment came, he chose none of this. He did not fall leading his last troops in the defense of Berlin. He did not face his conquerors with defiance. Instead, he opted for a clinical, private, and ultimately pathetic self-annihilation. This final act was the ultimate expression of his solipsism. The war for him was not about Germany, it was about him. His life was the life of the Reich, and therefore his death must be the death of the Reich. The order to destroy Germany's infrastructure in the final weeks, the infamous Nero Decree, was the ultimate act of a nihilist who believed that if he could not have the world, then no one could. The German people, who had adored him and followed him into the abyss, were to be destroyed along with him, for they had proven unworthy of his genius. This reveals the hollow core of his ideology. The national community he so often spoke of was nothing more than an extension of his own ego. His death, therefore, was not a tragedy for Germany, but the lancing of a cancerous boil. It was a squalid end for a man who had lived a squalid life, a life dedicated to the propagation of hatred and the pursuit of a delusional, genocidal fantasy. The historical debate over the exact details of his death, the conspiracy theories about his escape, all serve to obscure the most important truth, that he died a failure. His Thousand-Year Reich in ashes after a mere 12 years, his name a permanent stain on the history of his nation and the world. The horror of his life is not diminished by the pathetic nature of his death. Rather, it is amplified. It shows that the most monstrous of men can also be the most craven, that the architects of immense suffering can be, in the end, small, trembling figures, terrified of the world they have created. The story of Adolf Hitler's horrible death is a grim but necessary lesson in the banality of evil and the self-consuming nature of tyranny. It is a story that must be told and retold, not for sensationalism, but for the sake of remembrance, and as a bulwark against the darkness that he represents. The world he sought to create was a world of masters and slaves, of unending war and racial purity, a world that would have suffocated the human spirit. His failure is humanity's victory, a victory sealed in a squalid bunker, with a single gunshot that echoed through history.